Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Ryan Pronzinski of Christ Lutheran Church in Michigan Center, Michigan, and this is my Chair Chat Daily Devotion for Thursday, May 28, 2020. Peace be with you. These videos, as always, are intended to help you engage your life of faith, especially during this time of pandemic. So with that in mind, I encourage you throughout to take the time you need to pause, reflect, journal, have conversations with those around you, or do whatever it is that you need to engage your faith. With engagement in mind, I also highly encourage you to leave constructive comments, questions, or prayer requests in the comments section below, and I promise that I will get to those in future videos. With regard to the readings for the videos, they come from the Daily Revised Common Lectionary, which is a church calendar reading schedule, and it can be found online. The readings for today are Psalm 33, verses 12 through 22, Exodus 19, verses 1 through 9a, and Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, which you can read on your own. I will not be reading today, as that is part of the text which I will be reading for Sunday and be preaching on this Sunday. So please see the description below for those readings, and also please see the description below for the link to our Sunday morning services, including the one coming up, where I will be preaching on Acts chapter 2, as it will be Pentecost Sunday. So with that in mind, I encourage all of you out there that see these videos to join us at Christ Lutheran Church for our Sunday morning live stream service on Facebook Live. We live stream at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we would love to have you come join us then. At some point in time, it would be really nice if you're in the Michigan Center, Jackson area, to have you come join us in person, but we're frankly just not there yet. So please come join us on Facebook as you're able, whether it's live or watching the service after the live stream. Okay, so that takes us to our first reading, which comes from Psalm 33, verses 12 through 22, which reads as follows. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. My apologies for that. Random phone call. I'm going to start over, since I was only one verse in. So happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all humankind. From where he sits enthroned, he watches all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all, and observes all their deeds. A king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a vain hope for victory, and by its great might it cannot save. Truly, the eye of the Lord is on all who fear him, on those who hope in the Lord's steadfast love, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and shield. Our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. Here ends the reading. So today, as I read this psalm, I am hearing some very hopeful words from the psalmist this morning, as we sit in a health and economic crisis. Right? We hear in this psalm that a king or a nation, right, a group of people, because the king was representative of the nation. A king or a nation, quote, is not saved by their great army. And a great army is not able to, quote, deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Now, for us to just kind of put a, I don't want to say put a spin on it, but just a different lens, which is still, accurate to what's being said, these verses could sound like this. Your community the United States of America, the world, right, as opposed to just saying nation or king, is not saved by a mighty financial economy. A soaring stock market or mighty financial economy won't deliver souls from death or keep people alive during a time of pandemic. We had and still have a relatively strong economy, and yet today, over 100,000 lives here in the United States alone have died due to COVID-19. And this, of course, is hard news. It's the sad news. And I know I can speak for myself, that I grieve the loss of these 100,000 lives. We grieve for the families and friends of the 100,000 people who have lost their loved one. And we grieve for the families and friends of the thousands lost around the world. Now, during this hard time, though, the psalmist reminds us that God sees us, that God sees us, that God sees you, that God sees the hurting. I have here especially God sees the families who have suffered significant loss during these hard times. Quote, "The Lord watches all the inhabitants of the earth. The Lord is our help and shield." So as we might be scared that our seemingly mighty human constructs, right, instead of an army, our systems of, economic strength and governmental strength, they are struggling to save us. As we see this, we are reminded today that even as they seemingly fail to save us in the ways that we would hope for or honestly need, we are reminded by the psalmist that God will not fail to do so. Inevitably, God will not fail us, even if our human structures are failing. Put another way, God will not fail in saving you. And of course, in the end, we all die, right? But even in death, God will deliver us. That is the pinnacle of good news. And so as we get to Exodus 19, which is the other reading for today, we will be reminded of God's power to deliver, for that is what the Exodus story is all about. God delivering from essentially death to new life, from slavery and bondage in Egypt to, the promised land flowing with milk and honey and abundant life. But to end this section, though, the psalmist today encourages you to remember how God has helped us, how God has helped you. So I ask, how has your faith, how has your trust in God, or how is your faith, how is your trust in God helping you and helping those around you during these hard times? Because that is what the psalmist is relying on today during their hard time. And part of the deliverance that we all desire is having something to cling to have a hope that shields us from the despair, the depression, the worry, the fear. So how has your faith, your trust in God helped you or those around you during these hard times? For me, as I continue to find myself in God's stories, or in God's story, and I see how God's story, continues to take shape in our lives. Although we can't see the historic end to this pandemic, the literal historical timing and end of it all, I see God's story happening and taking shape right now. And so we know how God's stories end, right? With the Exodus, God's people are delivered from bondage and slavery to freedom and abundant life in the promised land. For Jesus jumping way forward and skipping a lot of people, we see God delivering Jesus through the grave to new life. And there's so much in between those two things. But as I keep seeing God calming storms, God seeing us through the flood, God seeing us through the fiery furnace, whatever the story might be. There is a hope, at least in my life, that as I see myself in God's story and God's stories happening in a new way today, there's a hope then that we know how the story ends, or we can trust and have hope that we know how the story ends, that it will end with our deliverance from this pandemic, from the fear, from the anxiety, from the hardship, from the loss. And as I have in my notes here, it's just a matter of when and how. It is not a question of if. God will deliver. And having this hope genuinely helps me sleep at night. I remember hearing on the news many people were losing sleep due to this pandemic, and I'm confident that others still are. I rest my head at night trusting God, even though I do have my worries. Right? I am hopeful that the death right now, both literal, but also the death of closeness and being comfortably in large social gatherings, right? Which I miss, like coffee hour at church and sharing stories and laughs and going out to Ann Arbor and having dinner with my family away from home. I miss these things. Those things are dead right now, but I have hope that God will resurrect them. We will be brought close together again. And no human structure alone is going to do this. God, through God's people, will make this happen. All right, on to Exodus 19, 1-9, which reads as follows. On the third new moon, after the Israelites had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that very day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They had journeyed from Rephidim, entered the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. Israel camped there in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God. The Lord called to him on the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the Israelites, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine. But you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites. So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him. The people all answered as one, Everything the Lord has spoken, we will do. Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to come to you in a dense cloud, in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after. Here ends the reading. So as I hinted to earlier in this video, we are reminded that our God, your God, is a God of deliverance. That is what we are reminded of in Exodus. Quote, How I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. That's straight from our reading today. And this is in part what I mean when I said earlier, by seeing God's story taking shape today in my own life and having hope that, that God will see me and God will see you and God will see all of us through. Because it's not hard to picture ourselves in our own wilderness, right? Where things feel somewhat lifeless. Yes, we are living, but it's not lush, it's not vast, it's not simple and comfortable, right? It's very harsh, and life feels quite deserted, right? That's not hard to picture our situation as a wilderness. And so we are in our own wilderness of sickness and social distancing and economic uncertainty and death. And several times in God's story, God has delivered God's people from the bondage of whatever wilderness they face and captivity, and has restored the people to life. So, as we are reminded in this story today, God will bring us to a place of life that God is preparing for us right now. That's what's in that quote, right? Again, quote, "I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself," meaning God has gone ahead of us, gone ahead to prepare the land flowing with milk and honey. And God comes to bring us to where God is. Jesus echoes these words in John 14. "I am going on ahead of you. I make a dwelling place, a place for you to be with me in relationship where I am going. And I wouldn't tell you about it if I didn't plan on coming back and bringing you to where I am." And here we hear that again is God's heart in Exodus. It continues to be God's heart. So if it continues to be God's heart from the Exodus to Jesus thousands of years later, us thousands of years after that can trust that it's still true for us today. Now, the one thing to keep in mind, though, as we look for and find ourselves in this in the loving delivering, the loving delivering wings, arms of God, is this. God calls us, God calls you to be a priestly kingdom, a holy nation, a holy group of people. That is to say, right, by priestly kingdom and holy nation, that as we see God delivering us in our lives, we are to show this loving deliverance of God to others, right? To be holy is to be seen and then point to God, right? To be set apart, to be distinct in such a way that we are recognizable in a good way. And then we point to God and we show God to be good and present and loving, to be the God who God is. When so many people's eyes right now, too, are downcast, due to grief and despair and depression and other hard emotions, quite frankly, they are not looking for or necessarily even able to see God right now. So what that means as a priestly kingdom, this is 1 Peter 2:8 and 9, which makes it you. You can look that up later. What that means is we have the opportunity and the joy right now to point out where God is at work in our lives and in the lives of the people around us as we see it and others don't. So that just as people grow to trust God in Moses in the reading today, when the loving words and actions of God are pointed out in the story, the loving promises of God are pointed out in the story, right? Just as the people grow to trust God and Moses in that way, people today, as we point out God to them, will have the ability to grow to trust that God is with them and delivering them too. Right? And so what this has looked like for me, just to give you kind of a, again, as I like to, a tangible example, is my grandpa calling me just a few days ago and very hopefully prodding me forward. I had even kind of forgotten that, honestly, I'd gotten stuck in some of my own goals in my life. Before the pandemic, he and I, we would talk about these goals that I had often. And we'd talk through them and come up with some plans of action. And when this pandemic hit, I'm sure you, like me, had your own goals too, and they got blown out of the water. They pretty much got obliterated and destroyed. Because a lot of it had to do with being in person with people in various ways. But in my most recent conversation with my grandfather, he shared with me some good news in his own life and how God had been delivering him in a way that, quite frankly, could have gotten blown up completely due to this pandemic too, but came through. And how, because of this deliverance that God had been preparing and brought him to, right, that he might actually be able to aid me even more now in my own personal goals. So as I sat in the wilderness and desolation of my seemingly destroyed plans, right, my own wilderness, my grandfather pointed to where God was at work delivering him, right, my grandpa, and showed how God then might be working to do the same for me. So now I am starting to work on those goals again, at least one of them anyway, with the voice of my grandfather acting as God's very voice, as God's wings too, to uplift me right now during these hard times, to encourage me, to inspire me to trust that I can accomplish this goal, and that God will deliver me, even though things still seem quite uncertain. And just reflecting on this morning, it's amazing what one simple phone call and a deep personal conversation, not just the, oh, hey, yeah, this weather's pretty nice, but no, really talking about one's sense of self and what one's trying to do in life, and really engaging deeply in conversation. It's amazing what that type of conversation with God at its heart, right, and keeping God in mind, the power that type of conversation can have. And the reality is, you all have this same opportunity and ability to cultivate this sense of God's presence and hope and deliverance for people too, because as God reminds us in Exodus today, God calls you a priestly kingdom, a holy nation. You are God's own. You are precious and beloved in God's sight. And so God equips you and empowers you to do amazing, remarkable, loving things that help deliver people and give life. And so I'll ask you to get you pondering about this a little bit. When have you walked with someone, as my grandfather did over the phone? So I have walked in quotes because we weren't actually walking, but that is to kind of journey with someone, even if it is in an emotional thinking way. When have you walked with someone and helped them accomplish a hard task, or to get back on track to accomplishing a hard task? When have you helped someone do that? Or maybe when has someone helped you do that? And how was that experience sacred or holy for you or the person you helped? Where did you see God in all of it? Just to get you thinking again, how God is already ahead of us and preparing the way, preparing the promised land of milk and honey, and will come back to bear us on God's wings and bring us to that place, to deliver us to that place, away from pandemic, away from economic hardship, away from fear, anxiety, and just all the stuff going on right now. All right, I'm going to end there and just say God bless you, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.